When the past knocks. The soft hum of the ceiling fan stirred the evening air in the modest, slightly cluttered kitchen. A chipped ceramic mug sat beside an overstuffed binder on the table, papers peeking out at odd angles. A half-empty plate of cold spaghetti sat abandoned next to it. Dinner Teresa had made hours ago, but never found the appetite to finish. The house was too quiet, and that was never a good thing. It was already dark outside, the faint orange glow from the streetlights casting long, warbled shadows through the thin curtains. Teresa rubbed her temples, the beginnings of a headache tightening around her skull. Between her long shift at the small-town legal office and the pile of unpaid bills waiting on the counter, there was no room left in her mind for anything else. "Mom." The voice was bright, chirping from the hallway like a bird cracking through the fog of Teresa's exhaustion. Emily's sneakers squeaked against the worn linoleum, her boundless energy filling the house like a gust of fresh air. Teresa glanced up just as her daughter appeared in the doorway. 14 now, all legs and enthusiasm, her oversized hoodie practically swallowing her slight frame. "I told you not to yell in the house," Teresa said, though the reprimand lacked any heat. She couldn't summon sternness when her daughter's smile was so infectious. "Sorry, but I have news. Big news." Emily's brown eyes sparkled with the same uncontainable excitement she always had, the kind that made Teresa marvel at how this child had managed to inherit so little of her own cautiousness and so much of her father's reckless hope. "I invited someone over for dinner tomorrow." Teresa froze, her hand halfway to her coffee cup. "You what?" Emily bounced on her heels, unable to keep still. "It's no big deal. There's this new kid at school. I think he's in 10th grade. And he's really quiet. Like, super quiet. And I noticed he never has lunch. Ever. Not even a granola bar. So I invited him over. You always say no one should go hungry, right?" The words stirred something in Teresa's chest, equal parts pride and panic. Emily had always been kind-hearted to a fault, constantly dragging in stray cats and lonely classmates alike. But there was something about the way she said it, the way her excitement seemed slightly forced, like she was trying too hard to make it sound normal. "What's his name?" Teresa asked, keeping her voice even. "Logan." Emily's smile faltered just a bit. "He doesn't talk much, but he said yes. Please, Mom. You'll love him." Teresa sighed, smoothing her hand over her knee to hide the shake in her fingers. They had so little to share, but saying no felt cruel. "Okay," she relented. "But just dinner." Emily squealed and hugged her, already racing upstairs to text her friends the news. Teresa sat back, a strange unease settling over her like a thin film of dust. There was something about the name Logan, something that prickled at the edges of her memory, too faint to place but too stubborn to ignore. The next evening, the spaghetti sauce simmered on the stove, filling the house with the rich scent of garlic and tomatoes. Emily was pacing the living room, peeking out the window every few minutes, practically vibrating with excitement. Teresa set the table with mismatched plates, her mind occupied by the check she knew would bounce if the electric bill auto-drafted before her paycheck cleared. The doorbell rang. "I'll get it." Emily bolted for the door, her socks sliding on the wood floor. "Wait," Teresa called, but her daughter had already yanked the door open. The bright porch light illuminated a figure standing at the threshold. Teresa stepped into the hallway, a polite smile already plastered to her face, the kind she wore at PTA meetings and parent-teacher conferences. But when she saw the boy standing in the doorway, the air left her lungs. Logan. The name collided with the face, and the world tilted. He stood awkwardly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, wearing a threadbare hoodie 2 sizes too big. His hands clutched the straps of his backpack so tightly his knuckles turned white. His hair, too long and uneven, hung in his eyes that were a haunting shade of hazel, so achingly familiar they punched through Teresa's chest like a fist. Those were David's eyes. The boy at her doorstep wasn't just any boy. He was David's son, the son of the woman David had left Teresa for, the son she swore she would never acknowledge, the boy whose very existence had once been a knife in her back. "Mom, this is Logan." Emily beamed, oblivious to the storm brewing in her mother's heart. Teresa gripped the doorframe so hard the wood bit into her palms. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't make sense of the past colliding with the present in such a brutal, unavoidable way. Logan's gaze darted everywhere. The porch light, the welcome mat, the peeling paint on the maillocks. Anywhere but her face. He knew who she was. That much was clear in the way his shoulders hunched, as if bracing for a blow. "Hi," he mumbled, voice hoarse and low, like someone unused to speaking. "Thanks for letting me come." Teresa's throat was so tight she could barely manage a nod. She stepped back, letting him in not because she wanted to, but because Emily's hand was already tugging him inside. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but to Teresa it sounded like the slamming of a cell door. Dinner was awkward, though Emily seemed blissfully unaware. She chattered on about school projects and her math teacher's obsession with pop quizzes. Logan barely spoke, but every time Teresa looked at him, she saw it, the ghost of her ex-husband's face, etched into Logan's cheekbones, his brow, the slope of his nose. She served him a heaping plate of spaghetti, her hands moving automatically, the same way they had the first time she'd made dinner for David all those years ago. The familiarity was nauseating, and yet, when Logan hesitated, as though unsure if he was truly allowed to eat, Teresa's heart clenched. He was so thin. He ate quickly, quietly, like someone who'd gone hungry more times than they could count. Each bite was measured, controlled, like he was afraid too much noise might get him thrown out. Teresa recognized the signs. She'd worked enough pro bono cases at the firm to know the look of a kid who'd learned to fend for themselves. She shouldn't care. She couldn't care. He wasn't her responsibility. But as Emily passed him the garlic bread, chatting about some game they played in science class, Logan's face softened just slightly. It was the barest flicker of warmth, like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. But Teresa saw it, and against all reason, a crack formed in the wall she'd spent over a decade building. After dinner, Logan helped clear the table without being asked. Teresa caught him wiping down the counters with the care of someone who wasn't used to leaving fingerprints behind. It broke her heart in ways she didn't want to name. "You don't have to do that," she said, her voice gentler than she intended. Logan shrugged. "It's okay." The exchange was brief, but his voice, so quiet, so careful, lingered in her mind long after he retreated to the living room with Emily. Teresa stood at the sink, staring out the window at the darkened street. The reflection in the glass showed her face, older, more tired, but still carrying the weight of a betrayal that had never fully healed. And now, standing in her living room, was the living, breathing proof of that betrayal. A boy who looked too much like the man who had shattered her life. And yet, there was no malice in him, only uncertainty, only hunger, not just for food, but for something far more intangible. Belonging. Teresa gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles turning white. This was going to break her, or it was going to save her. She just didn't know which yet. A house divided, a heart torn open. The guest room was barely used, a space that had once held the occasional relative passing through town or a friend crashing after too much wine on book club night. Now it had a more permanent occupant. The thin mattress groaned slightly beneath Logan's weight as he sat on the edge of the bed, his back hunched, elbows resting on his knees. The dim glow from the hallway spilled into the room, cutting a line across the worn carpet. His backpack, the only possession he seemed to have brought with him, slumped against the wall. Teresa stood just outside the doorway, her hands gripping the doorframe to steady herself. She didn't know how to do this, didn't know how to reconcile the gnawing ache in her chest with the sharp voice in her head that screamed at her to send him away. He was David's son, a living reminder of everything she'd lost. Every time she looked at him, her body braced for the familiar wave of resentment, the bitterness that had sustained her through the hardest years. But that wasn't what came. What came was something much worse. Pity. It made her furious. She didn't want to pity him. Pity was dangerous. Pity was a crack in the dam, and she knew how quickly cracks could turn into floods. "Do you need anything?" The words were stiff, foreign in her mouth. Logan startled, glancing up at her like he hadn't realized she was there. His hazel eyes flickered to the floor almost immediately, shoulders curling inward. "No," he mumbled. "Thanks." Teresa lingered for a moment too long, her hands tightening against the doorframe until the wood bit into her palms. "Okay," she said, and she meant to leave. Really, she did. But her feet wouldn't move. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to resent him, blame him for every tear she'd cried, every time Emily asked why Daddy didn't come back. But this boy, this thin, nervous boy who looked at her like she might shatter him with a word, wasn't the villain she'd built up in her mind. He was just a kid, one who'd had every adult in his life fail him. "Good night," she said softly, before her own walls could crumble. She turned before he could respond, her footsteps echoing down the hall. The next morning, Logan was already awake when Teresa stumbled into the kitchen, still tying her robe around her waist. He stood at the sink, his back to her, sleeves pushed up to his elbows as he washed last night's dishes. The sponge moved methodically over the plates, each stroke careful and precise, like he was afraid of leaving a single smear. "You don't have to do that," Teresa said from the doorway, her voice still gravelly from sleep. Logan's shoulders tensed. "It's no big deal," he muttered, keeping his head down. Teresa's instinct was to argue, to insist that he didn't owe her anything. But another part of her, the part that knew exactly what it felt like to cling to small routines in a world spiraling out of control, stopped her. "All right," she said instead, crossing to the coffee maker. The silence between them stretched thin, taut like a rubber band about to snap. Logan didn't make eye contact, but his movements never faltered. Sponge to plate, rinse, dry, repeat. Teresa tried to focus on pouring her coffee, but her gaze kept drifting back to him. There was something about the way he stood, shoulders always slightly hunched, as if trying to make himself smaller. She recognized it too well. It was the posture of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible, someone conditioned to believe that even their presence was an inconvenience. She should have asked more questions about his mother, about what had driven him to Emily, to their doorstep. But she didn't want to know. Knowing would make it real. And if it was real, then sending him away would become impossible. The front door creaked open, and Emily's voice rang out. "Logan, come on. We're gonna miss the bus." Logan dropped the dish towel like it was on fire, grabbing his backpack and practically bolting from the kitchen. Teresa followed them to the door, her coffee forgotten on the counter. "Bye, Mom." Emily waved cheerfully, already halfway down the driveway. Logan gave her a quick, almost fearful glance, then nodded. "Thanks for letting me stay." The words were so quiet she almost didn't hear them. And then he was gone, swallowed up by the morning mist. Teresa stood in the doorway long after the bus had disappeared around the corner, her coffee growing cold in her hand, her heart a battlefield between instinct and history. That night, Teresa sat on the edge of her bed, phone in hand, staring at a name she hadn't seen on her screen in years. David Carter. Her thumb hovered over the call button. She should call, shouldn't she? This was his responsibility, not hers. He was Logan's father. He should know where his son was. But the thought of hearing his voice, of the inevitable smugness, the carefully rehearsed justifications, made her stomach churn. She remembered the last time they spoke, his voice oozing insincere regret, the kind that carried no weight. She set the phone down without calling. If David didn't care enough to know where his son was, she wasn't about to do his dirty work for him. Over the next few days, the house adjusted to Logan like an old shoemaking room for a pebble. He was quiet, so quiet Teresa often forgot he was there. He cleaned without being asked, ate with the same quiet desperation every meal, and spoke only when absolutely necessary. But there were small things, subtle things. Emily adored him, as though she'd appointed herself his personal tour guide to their world. She dragged him along to walk the dog, chattered endlessly at him about everything from her favorite bands to her least favorite vegetables, and called him brother without a second thought. At first, Logan flinched at the word, but slowly, day by day, the flinches became smaller. By the end of the week, he was only tensing slightly when she said it. Progress, Teresa supposed. One night, after the house had gone quiet, Teresa passed Logan's room on her way to bed. The door was cracked open, and through the sliver of space, she saw him sitting on the edge of the bed, head bowed, an old crumpled piece of paper in his hands. She didn't mean to intrude, but something in his posture, the sheer weight pressing down on his thin shoulders, stopped her in her tracks. The paper was worn, creased so many times the edges were nearly disintegrating. Logan's thumb traced one corner over and over, the repetitive motion almost hypnotic. He folded it carefully and slipped it under his pillow, lying down fully clothed, facing the wall. Teresa stood there a moment longer, her heart aching in ways she couldn't explain. She didn't know what was written on that paper. She didn't need to. On Saturday, the phone rang just as Teresa was folding laundry, the scent of fabric softener lingering in the air. She answered automatically, cradling the phone between her shoulder and ear. "Mrs. Carter." The voice was clipped, professional, the kind Teresa recognized from years of working at the law firm. "This is Amanda Green with Child Protective Services." Teresa's hands froze on a pair of Emily's socks. "We received an anonymous tip that you're harboring a minor without legal guardianship. We need to schedule a home visit immediately." Teresa's blood turned to ice. "He's not. I'm not harboring anyone. He's my ex-husband's son. He just showed up." There was no empathy in Amanda Green's voice. "Regardless, without proper guardianship, this arrangement is legally questionable. I'm available Monday morning." The line went dead. Teresa stood frozen in the middle of the living room, the folded socks slipping from her numb fingers. Logan was asleep on the couch, a rare smile flickering across his face as Emily's head rested on his shoulder, both of them curled up under a shared blanket. The sight made Teresa's throat tighten with a fierce, protective love that caught her completely off guard. This wasn't just a stray kid anymore. This was her family, and she would fight for him. Unspoken truths and fragile bonds. The house was silent, but Teresa's mind was anything but. The phone call from Child Protective Services still rang in her ears like a fire alarm that wouldn't shut off. She sat at the kitchen table long after she'd hung up, staring at the uneven wood grain, as though it held the answer to the 1,000 questions racing through her head. What would they see when they came on Monday? Would they see the vacuum lines still crisp in the carpet, the dishes stacked neatly, the photos of Emily's art projects covering the fridge? Would they see Logan laughing at the dinner table last night, the way he'd smiled, really smiled, when Emily had accidentally spilled her milk and turned it into a game? Or would they just see the paperwork, the lack of official custody, the legal cracks they could pry wide open until everything came crashing down? Her stomach twisted. If they took Logan, she wasn't sure he'd survive it. She wasn't sure she would. The next morning, Teresa stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with slightly more force than necessary. The skillet sizzled, steam curling up from the edges as the chocolate chips melted into gooey swirls. Logan sat at the table, hands folded tightly in his lap, his gaze flicking between Teresa and Emily, who was humming some off-key tune as she colored at the other end of the table. He was still like that, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Even in sleep, his body curled in on itself, like he expected someone to rip the blankets away. "Do you want syrup?" Teresa asked, her voice too bright. too forced. Logan hesitated, then gave a small nod. Sure. Thanks. He never asked for anything. That was something Teresa had learned quickly. He took what was given. Food, a bed, silence, but never more. Like asking might make the whole fragile arrangement collapse. She carried the plate to him, setting it down carefully. You don't have to eat if you're not hungry, she added, trying to sound casual. But it's there. Emily lifted her head, grinning. Mom makes the best pancakes. They're kind of her thing. Teresa rolled her eyes. I'm a one-trick pony. Logan's smile was fleeting but real. They're good, he said softly, and to Teresa, it felt like the highest praise. Later that afternoon, while Emily was at a friend's house, Teresa found Logan in the backyard. He sat on the weathered bench beneath the maple tree, the branches above him shifting in the breeze. His notebook, the one she'd noticed tucked into his backpack, rested on his knees. She approached quietly, her sneakers barely making a sound on the grass. Hey. Logan jumped slightly but didn't close the notebook, which surprised her. His fingers tightened around the edges, though like he was bracing for her to snatch it away. Mind if I sit? She asked. He shrugged. It's your yard. Teresa lowered herself onto the bench beside him, leaving enough space between them for comfort. The silence stretched, soft and fragile, broken only by the rustling leaves. What are you writing? She asked, not because she wanted to pry, but because she wanted him to feel like his voice mattered. Logan hesitated. Just stuff. Stuff like what? He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath you release when you're not sure if you should jump or stay put. Sometimes I write letters, he said quietly. Ones I don't send. Teresa's throat tightened. To who? Logan's knuckles went white. My mom. Sometimes to him. The word him sat heavy between them. David, the man who had walked out of Teresa's life, and Logan's, leaving nothing but fractured trust in his wake. What do you say? She asked gently. Logan's gaze dropped to the notebook. Sometimes I ask why. Sometimes I apologize, even though I don't know what I'm sorry for. His voice broke slightly. Mostly, I ask what I did wrong. Teresa's chest ached with a familiar, unbearable pain, the kind only a parentless child could carry. It was the same weight she'd seen in her own daughter's eyes, the same questions Emily had once asked about why her dad left. You didn't do anything wrong, Teresa said firmly, the words spilling out before she could think. You didn't deserve what happened to you. Logan's shoulders lifted in a shrug, but his eyes glistened with something dangerously close to hope, like a drowning man reaching for a branch he wasn't sure could hold his weight. You don't have to believe me yet, she added softly, but I'll keep saying it until you do. Logan didn't answer, but he didn't pull away either. That night, Teresa lay awake long after the house had gone quiet. The soft creak of the wind against the window, the distant hum of a passing car, and the faintest sound of Logan shifting in the guest room were the only noises. The letter from CPS sat on her nightstand, mocking her. She should have called David. Let him deal with this. It was his son, after all, not hers. But as she stared at the ceiling, she realized something terrifying. She wanted him to stay. She wanted Logan to be hers, not out of obligation, not because he was David's son, but because he was Logan, because he folded the laundry when she was too tired, because he sat with Emily when she was scared of thunderstorms, because his quiet presence had become part of their home, because in his silence, Teresa saw herself, the version of herself who had sat in this very house after David left, wondering what she'd done wrong, learning to build a life out of nothing. Maybe they could both learn together. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, but the knot in Teresa's stomach only grew tighter. Logan was in the garage, fixing the broken hinge on the old cabinet door. Teresa stood in the doorway, watching his careful, deliberate movements. Each turn of the screwdriver was measured, precise, the work of someone who had learned to fix things as a form of survival. "You're good at that," she said quietly. Logan glanced up, startled. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing," she said. "Thank you." He gave a small nod, his ears turning pink, and Teresa wondered how long it had been since anyone had thanked him for anything. As she turned to go back inside, Logan's voice stopped her. "Are they really coming tomorrow?" he asked, his back still to her. Teresa's heart twisted. "Yeah." "Are they gonna take me away?" She swallowed hard. "I don't know." He nodded, as if that was the answer he expected. "Do you want to stay?" she asked, her voice softer than it had been in years. For a long moment, Logan didn't answer. Then, finally, he nodded. "Yeah." "Then we'll fight," Teresa said firmly. Logan turned toward her, and for the first time, the vulnerability in his expression was unguarded. "Why would you fight for me?" Teresa's throat tightened, her voice thick with emotion. "Because you deserve someone who will." Logan's eyes glistened, and he quickly turned back to the cabinet, but not before Teresa saw the flicker of something fragile and beautiful in his face. Hope. That night, Emily climbed into Logan's lap on the couch without warning. Her gangly limbs sprawled across him like a puppy. "You can't leave," she announced firmly. Logan, startled, gave a half laugh. "Okay. I mean it." Emily poked his shoulder. "Mom, and I already decided. You're stuck with us." Logan's smile, small, crooked, and so heartbreakingly rare, made Teresa's heart ache. "Okay," he said again, and this time, he almost believed it. Teresa stood at the window after they'd gone to bed, her arms wrapped around herself. The wind whispered through the trees, and for the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel empty. They were a mess, this little makeshift family, broken in places, fragile in others. But they were together. And tomorrow, they would fight to stay that way. When the walls come down, the house was too quiet for a Monday morning. It was the kind of silence Teresa associated with waiting rooms, where the air felt too thin and every creak of a chair or shuffle of a paper made her jump. Logan sat at the kitchen table, his untouched bowl of cereal slowly turning soggy, while Emily sat beside him, her usual chatter absent. Even she knew today wasn't a day for jokes. "Are they gonna ask me questions?" Logan's voice was so soft Teresa almost missed it. She was pouring coffee. A habit, not a need, since her stomach was too knotted to handle even a sip. "They might," she admitted, "but you don't have to be scared." He didn't look convinced. Teresa sat across from him, wrapping her hands around the warm mug just to have something to hold on to. "They're going to ask about school, about meals, about where you sleep. Just be honest." Logan's hand toyed with the edge of his sleeve, twisting the frayed fabric between his fingers. "What if they ask about my mom?" Teresa hesitated. "You don't have to say anything you're not ready to." Logan gave a half shrug, his eyes still downcast. "What if they ask if I want to stay here?" Teresa's heart squeezed. She knew the answer she wanted to hear, but more than that, she knew how fragile that truth was for him. Wanting something, for a kid like Logan, had always been dangerous. Hope was something he'd learned to bury deep. "You tell them the truth," she said softly. "Whatever that is." He nodded, but the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. At precisely 9:30, the doorbell rang. Teresa's palms were already sweaty, and she wiped them on her jeans before opening the door. The woman standing there was mid-50s, her gray-streaked hair pulled back into a low ponytail. A clipboard rested against her side, and the lines around her mouth suggested she was a woman who'd seen too much and stopped being shocked a long time ago. "Mrs. Carter?" she asked. "Yes. Please, come in." The woman stepped inside, her sharp eyes already sweeping the space, the slightly scuffed hardwood, the worn but clean couch, the photos on the walls, all a patchwork of Emily's baby years and awkward school pictures. "Sarah Matthews," the social worker introduced herself, her voice not unkind, but also not warm. Teresa gestured toward the kitchen, where Logan and Emily were still at the table. "This is Logan. And my daughter, Emily." Sarah gave them both a polite nod before settling into the chair Teresa had cleared for her. "I understand Logan's been staying with you for some time now." Teresa sat across from her, back ramrod straight. "That's right. He's my ex-husband's son." Sarah's pen scratched across the paper. "And do you have any formal custody arrangement?" "No," Teresa admitted. "He showed up with nowhere to go. His mother." She paused, glancing at Logan. She made it clear he wasn't welcome. Sarah's expression didn't change, but the pause of her pen told Teresa that part of the story was all too familiar. "Logan, would you mind if I asked you a few questions privately?" Sarah's voice softened slightly. Logan's shoulders hunched, but he nodded. Teresa gave him what she hoped was a reassuring smile as he followed Sarah into the living room. The silence that filled the kitchen after they left was thick enough to choke on. Emily slid closer to her mom, her voice barely a whisper. "They can't take him, right?" Teresa's throat tightened. "I don't know, sweetheart." Emily's hand gripped hers, small fingers curling tight. "But he's ours now." Teresa's heart ached at the simplicity of her daughter's certainty. She wished the world worked like that, where love was enough to make things permanent. In the living room, Logan sat on the edge of the couch, his back straight, hands clenching the knees of his jeans. Sarah sat across from him, her clipboard resting on her lap. "Can you tell me how long you've been staying here, Logan?" He shifted, eyes flicking to the window. "A few weeks." "And before that?" Logan's jaw worked. "At my mom's." Sarah's voice remained even, gentle but clinical. "Can you tell me why you left?" He hesitated. His fingers twisted the edge of his sleeve again, tugging at the loose thread until it threatened to unravel completely. "She drinks a lot," Logan said finally, the words barely more than a whisper. "Sometimes she forgets I'm there." Sarah's expression didn't change, but her pen moved quickly across the page. "Did she ever hurt you?" Logan's face stayed carefully blank. "Not really. Not really." He swallowed hard. "She'd yell, throw stuff, sometimes. Mostly, she just forgot." The pen slowed. "And your father?" Logan's laugh was short and sharp, with no humor in it. "I don't have one." Sarah's brow lifted slightly. "You do. Legally." Logan's throat worked, but no words came. "Do you feel safe here with Mrs. Carter?" Sarah's voice gentled again. Logan's head dipped in a tiny nod. "Yeah." "Do you want to stay?" He froze. This was it. The question that terrified him more than any other. Wanting was dangerous. Admitting it was even worse. Wanting something meant it could be taken away. His voice cracked. "Yeah." "Okay." Sarah's smile was small, but it was real. After Sarah left, the house felt too big and too quiet again. Logan retreated to the guest room, the door half shut, while Emily bounced between the living room and the kitchen, her nerves turning her into a tornado of motion. Teresa stood at the sink, hands braced against the counter, staring out the window without really seeing. The knot in her stomach hadn't eased. If anything, it had grown tighter. She wanted to believe it would be okay. That Sarah had seen how much Logan belonged here, how much Emily adored him, how much Teresa cared. But the law didn't always care about feelings. That night, Logan couldn't sleep. He lay on his side, watching the crack of light beneath the door stretch and shift with every passing hour. His mind wouldn't stop, spinning with memories of his mom's slurred voice, the crack of glass shattering against the wall, the sickening silence after she passed out on the couch. He didn't belong anywhere. Not really. This house, this family, they were a borrowed dream, a too soft bed and warm food and people who smiled at him for no reason. He didn't deserve it. But for the first time, he wanted it. That was the scariest part. At midnight, Teresa found him sitting at the kitchen table, knees drawn up to his chest, staring at nothing. "You okay?" she asked softly. Logan startled slightly but didn't move. She sat across from him, pulling her robe tighter around herself against the cool night air. "Can't sleep." He shook his head. They sat in silence for a long while. The house creaked and settled around them. "Are they going to take me away?" Logan's voice was so quiet she almost missed it. Teresa's hands clenched in her lap. "I don't know." Logan's head dropped, his hair falling into his face. "If they do, thanks for letting me stay." Teresa's throat tightened. "Logan, listen to me." She leaned forward, her voice low but fierce. "You're not a burden. You're not a problem we took in because we had to." Logan's eyes flicked up, wary and disbelieving. "You're part of this family," she said firmly, "whether they say so or not." His breath caught. And for a moment, Teresa saw it. The fragile, desperate hope he buried under layers of caution. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice cracking. Teresa reached across the table, her hand warm over his cold fingers. "Me too." They sat there, hand in hand, the silence no longer empty but full. Of fear, yes, but also of something softer. Hope. Between a doorstep and a home. The storm arrived just before dawn. Not the kind with thunder and lightning. This one was quieter. A steady, relentless rain that pattered against the windows like fingers tapping, demanding attention. Teresa stood in the kitchen, a coffee mug warming her hands, though the coffee itself had long gone cold. The sky outside was the same color as the inside of her heart. Heavy, gray, restless. Upstairs, she could hear Emily's muffled laughter, bright, despite the dreary morning, blending with Logan's lower, hesitant voice. It was strange how quickly they'd fallen into a rhythm, as though the house had been waiting for him to arrive. Like some missing piece of a puzzle they hadn't known was incomplete. Teresa couldn't decide if that terrified her or gave her hope. Maybe both. The CPS visit had come and gone, but the absence of immediate judgment only left her more anxious. Sarah Matthews had taken notes, asked questions, and left with nothing more than a polite nod and a promise to be in touch soon. That was 2 days ago. Now, every ring of the phone, every knock at the door, felt like it might be the blow that shattered everything they were trying to build. Logan sat at the kitchen table, shoulders hunched, his notebook open in front of him. The worn edges curled slightly from too many nights of being crammed into a backpack, and the pages were filled with uneven handwriting. A mix of letters, half-finished sentences, and words scratched out until the paper nearly tore. He wasn't writing anything now, just staring. Teresa crossed the room quietly, setting a glass of orange juice beside him. "You okay?" He gave the usual shrug. "I'm fine." But fine was a lie. Teresa knew it, even if Logan didn't. He carried his silence like a shield, using it to keep the world and her at arm's length. But over the last week, there were cracks forming in the armor. Tiny moments when his guard slipped, when the scared kid beneath the careful mask peeked through. She just didn't know if she'd have enough time to help him see that he didn't need the armor anymore. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked softly. Logan shook his head, fingers curling around the notebook edges like they were his lifeline. "It doesn't matter." "It does," Teresa said firmly. "It matters because you matter." Logan's hand froze. The words so alien they seemed to disorient him. He opened his mouth, then shut it again, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and longing. "It's okay if you're scared," Teresa said. "We're all scared." Logan's throat worked as he swallowed. "What if they take me?" "We fight," Teresa said without hesitation. "We fight for you." He stared down at the notebook, and she could see the words he couldn't say swimming just beneath the surface. "No one's ever fought for me before." Emily appeared in the doorway, wearing her oversized hoodie and socks that didn't match. She held a plastic tiara in her hand, the cheap kind with pink jewels that she'd long outgrown but never stopped loving. "Family movie night?" she asked, eyes bright with hope. Teresa almost said no. She had work to do. The paperwork for her emergency custody petition sat waiting on the dining table, an overwhelming pile of legal jargon and blank spaces where signatures should go. But then she saw the way Emily was already tugging Logan toward the living room, the way Logan didn't resist, how he let himself be pulled into her orbit like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Yeah," Teresa said, forcing a smile. "Family movie night." They settled on the couch, a tangle of blankets and mismatched pillows, bowls of popcorn balanced on knees. Emily picked the movie, some animated adventure they'd seen a dozen times before, and narrated every plot twist as though it were brand new. Logan sat at the far end of the couch at first, perched like a guest who wasn't sure how long he was welcome. But halfway through, Emily's head dropped onto his shoulder, and when she didn't move, neither did he. Teresa watched it all from her spot in the armchair, warmth blooming in her chest. It was fragile, this thing between them, but it was real. And for now, real was enough. It wasn't until after Emily had gone to bed, the movie credits long since rolled, that Teresa found Logan standing at the back door, hands shoved into his hoodie pockets, staring out at the rain-slicked yard. "You okay?" she asked, stepping beside him. Logan's shoulders lifted in a shrug. "I don't get it." "Get what?" "This." He gestured vaguely at the house, the kitchen, the worn couch, the faint hum of the dishwasher running in the background. "This whole thing. Why are you being nice to me?" Teresa's breath caught. "Because you deserve it." "No, I don't." The words came fast, too fast, like they'd been sitting on the tip of his tongue for years. "I'm the reason your life fell apart." Teresa flinched. She'd wondered when it would come, when the unspoken truth would claw its way into the light. That Logan knew, even if no one had ever said it out loud, that his very existence was tangled up in the unraveling of her marriage. But hearing it from him, in that broken voice, was almost unbearable. "You didn't ruin my life," she said softly. Logan's laugh was bitter, sharp. "My mom sure did." Teresa hesitated, then shook her head. "Your mom made choices. Your dad made choices. But you were just a kid." Logan didn't respond. The rain tapped gently against the window, filling the silence. "I was angry for a long time," Teresa admitted, her voice quiet. "Angry at your mom, at David, even at you, and you hadn't done anything but exist." She took a slow breath. "But I'm not angry anymore." "Why not?" Teresa turned to face him fully. "Because you're here, and you matter. Not because of where you came from, or who your parents are, but because of who you are." Logan's hands clenched in his pockets. "What if I screw everything up?" "You won't." Teresa's voice was firm. "But if you do, we'll figure it out. That's what family does." The word hung between them, fragile and terrifying. Family. Logan's breath hitched, but he didn't pull away. That was enough. For now. The next afternoon, Teresa found a crumpled piece of paper on the floor beside Logan's bed. It had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases were nearly worn through. She knew she shouldn't read it, but she did. "Dear Mom, I know you probably don't care, but I'm safe. They let me stay for now, but I'm pretty sure it won't last. It never does. I'm trying not to screw this up. They're nice here. Too nice. I don't get it. They act like I belong even though I know I don't. Emily says I'm her brother now. I don't know how to be that. But I think I'd want to. I just don't know how. If they send me back to you, I'll be better this time. I'll stay out of your way. I'll fix the things you throw, clean up after you. Maybe you'll want me again. If they let me stay here, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know how to believe I deserve it. But maybe, I do. I hope you're okay, even if you don't care if I am. Logan." Teresa's vision blurred with tears. She pressed the paper to her chest, the weight of Logan's quiet heartbreak settling deep into her bones. He wanted to belong. He just didn't know how. But if there was one thing Teresa understood, it was rebuilding from nothing. She would show him how. That night, she placed a new notebook on Logan's pillow. A note was tucked inside the cover. Write your letters, even if you never send them, but also write one to yourself. Write the things you deserve to believe. You belong here, and you are wanted. Teresa. She left the door cracked, just in case. Home is where you're fought for. The waiting was the hardest part. The days after the CPS visit stretched out longer than they should have, filling every corner of the house with tension, like a thin wire stretched tight enough to snap at the slightest touch. Even Emily, whose energy normally ran like a freight train through their home, was quieter than usual. At the heart of it all was Logan, a boy who still didn't know how to sit comfortably in the space he'd been offered. He moved like a ghost, always hovering near the edges of rooms, never quite claiming a spot for himself. Teresa noticed it all. The way he folded and refolded the sleeves of his hoodie, the way he set his fork down quietly after every bite, like he was afraid making noise might remind them he was there. But the biggest change was the notebook. The new one Teresa had left on his pillow. It followed him everywhere, tucked under his arm on the way to school, slipped into his lap when they watched TV, resting beside his plate at dinner. He never opened it in front of them, but the pen marks staining his fingers told her it was being used. That was enough. For now. The letter came on a Friday. Teresa found it waiting in the mailbox, the envelope crisp and official. Her hands shook as she carried it inside, setting it on the table without opening it. Is that it? Logan's voice startled her. He stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes locked on the letter like it might catch fire if he looked away too long. Teresa nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat. Do you want me to open it? Logan shrugged, but his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Teresa sat down at the table, her fingers slipping under the flap, tearing it open with slow, deliberate care. The paper inside was smooth and professional, covered in words she'd seen 1,000 times in her work at the law firm. Formal language designed to soften the blow of life-changing news. She scanned the letter, her breath caught in her throat. Then she read it again, slower this time, making sure she wasn't imagining the words. Logan, she said softly, you can stay. His breath left him in a rush, like he'd been holding it for weeks. What? They approved emergency guardianship, she said, her voice trembling. It means you're officially part of this house, of this family. The word hung in the air between them. Family. Logan's hands unclenched. He took a half step back, like the weight of it was too much to hold. But what about my dad? Teresa's expression hardened. He didn't contest it. Logan blinked. He didn't care. Teresa stood, crossing to him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. It's not about him anymore, she said quietly. It's about us. And you. Logan swallowed hard, his throat working against the flood of emotions he didn't know how to release. I don't know how to do this. Neither do I, Teresa admitted with a soft smile. But we'll figure it out. Together. That night, Logan sat on the back porch, the cool wood beneath him grounding him in the moment. The sky overhead was a stretch of dark blue, stars scattered like tiny cracks in the night. The house behind him glowed with soft, warm light, the muffled sounds of Emily's laughter filtering through the window. Teresa stepped outside, 2 mugs in her hands, one filled with tea, the other with cocoa. Mind some company? She asked. Logan shook his head. She handed him the cocoa, and they sat together in silence for a while. The night was calm, the air cool and still. You know, Teresa said eventually, I used to sit out here a lot. Logan glanced sideways at her. After David left, she continued, her fingers curling around the warm mug. I'd sit here after Emily went to bed and wonder if I was strong enough to do it alone. If I could be everything she needed. You were, Logan said softly. Teresa smiled. I'm still figuring it out. Logan took a sip of his cocoa, the sweetness almost too much after years of watered-down powdered packets. I guess I'm still figuring out how to not screw this up. You're not screwing anything up, Teresa said firmly. Logan, you're allowed to be here. You're allowed to belong. He stared down into the mug, his reflection wavering in the dark liquid. It's weird. What is? Being wanted. Teresa's breath caught. I mean, Logan's voice faltered. It's not like I ever thought I'd end up here. With you. After everything. Teresa set her mug aside, turning to face him. I want you to hear me, okay? What happened between me and your dad? That's not your fault. None of it. He shook his head. But I was part of. You were just a baby, Teresa interrupted. A baby who deserved better than the mess we made. And I'm sorry you didn't get it. Logan's fingers curled around the mug, holding on like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. I'm not used to people fighting for me. Well, Teresa said softly, get used to it. The next morning, Teresa found Logan and Emily in the living room, sprawled across the floor with a half-finished puzzle between them. Emily was narrating the story of how the puzzle's mountain landscape reminded her of the time they'd gone camping, which, according to her, was a grand adventure involving a bear. It was actually a raccoon. And a ghost in the woods, a tree branch scraping the tent. Logan was quiet, but his smile was real. Teresa stood in the doorway, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in years. Contentment. The fragile, beautiful piece of a home no longer haunted by the past. Breakfast is ready, she said, and for once, it didn't feel like an announcement so much as a call to family. Logan stood first, offering Emily a hand up. She took it without hesitation, as if they'd always been that way, two siblings navigating life together. At the table, Teresa served pancakes, piling them high with syrup and whipped cream, because today was a celebration. No more waiting, no more wondering. They were a family, whether the law said so or not. As they ate, Emily launched into her usual animated stories, her hands flying through the air, syrup dripping down her fingers. Logan listened, his fork slowly twirling a piece of pancake in syrup, the corners of his mouth tugging into a small smile. It was ordinary, and that was the miracle. Halfway through breakfast, Teresa stood, reaching into the drawer near the fridge. She turned back to Logan, holding out a small silver key. He stared at it, confused. What's this? It's yours, she said. Your key to this house. Your home. Logan's fingers curled around the key, the metal cool against his skin. For a long moment, he didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was thick with emotion. Thank you. Teresa leaned down, pressing a kiss to the top of his head, a gesture so natural it startled them both. You're stuck with us now, she whispered. Emily grinned. Told you. I called it first. Logan's laughter, real and unguarded, filled the kitchen. And just like that, they weren't strangers anymore. They were home. They were family. And for Logan, for the first time, that word didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like hope.